Piers Torday is an award-winning children's novelist. He began his working life as a theatre and TV producer, but after taking a writing course run by Ted Hughes in 2008, he began writing a story which in 2013 was eventually published as The Last Wild, the first in the much-loved and well-known Last Wild trilogy. It was nominated for numerous awards, including the Carnegie Award, the Waterstones Children's Book Prize, and the UKLA Award. It's since been published in 14 other countries, including the US and China. The second book in the series, The Dark Wild, won the Guardian Children's Fiction Prize in 2014. Piers recently met with Nikki Gamble to talk about his new title, The Frozen Sea, the sequel to The Lost Magician in his latest fantasy adventure series.
Piers's books are a real favourite with teachers because they are not only cracking stories, well told, but they also give us a lot to ponder on and reflect on and think about. So it's not surprising that they've become really well read and used in schools. So today, Piers, we're going to be talking about the latest series, which starts with a book called The Lost Magician. Obviously, the second one, The Frozen Sea, is published now, but in order to really get into the Frozen Sea, I feel we need to set the scene by going back to The Lost Magician. I wonder if you can set it up for us without destroying the ending.
So, The Lost Magician is a book. The story may sound a bit familiar to some people. The story begins at the end of the Second World War, and 4 children who live in London. Their home has not been destroyed in the Blitz, but a bomb has fallen in a nearby street, and it's cracks gone up the house, so it's not safe to live in. So while their parents find a new home, Simon, Patricia, Evelyn and Larry are packed off to stay in the country in Wiltshire in a big old house that's lived in by an old friend of theirs who is a professor. And when the children get to this house, beautiful summer, the professor says that they can go absolutely anywhere they like in this house, go outside into any of the bedrooms, but they mustn't go to the top floor. So obviously, it being a book, the second the children start exploring the house, Larry, who's the youngest, with his little grey bear, his devoted grey bear, explores the house, and he does go to the top floor, but to his great disappointment finds there's nothing there. It's very boring. And he turns around to go back down the stairs when suddenly there's this strange noise, and he turns around and there is an old wooden door full of mysterious carvings with a light glowing behind it. And because he's 8 and not afraid of anything, he pushes open the door and he discovers not a wardrobe, as some of you might be thinking, but a magical library. And in this library there are 3 aisles of shelves. One marked red, as in have you read this book? One marked unread, and one marked never read or never read. And Larry, because he loves stories, goes down the aisle marked red, and he suddenly finds himself in this kind of fairy tale land, the land of the Reds, which is where all story characters go to live once they've been read. They have to go somewhere. And he meets a little fairy, the tiniest fairy, the first fairy tale ever told, Tom Thumb. And Tom Thumb explains to him that all is not well in the land of the Reds, because they're at war with their neighbours, the city of the Unreds. And Unreds are, of course, the other thing you find in libraries, which is facts and information. Unread, because there's so many of them still yet to be discovered. And so these children who have survived the trauma and the horror of the Second World War find themselves plunged into another war, a war between story characters and facts, between stories and facts. And we're not going to say what the never-reads are, but it leads to a pretty extraordinary conclusion. And they really have discovered this world of folio, which is the world of folio, which is where both the land of the Reds and the city of the Unreds and the Never-Reds are all part of this one world. And really, folio is the world of the imagination, and that's the kind of fantasy world I wanted to create, The Lost Magician, and that we then going to explore in the next book.
So it's really obvious in that excellent setup that we're not looking at just a reimagining of the story of the Chronicles of Narnia. but it's also obvious to us that that's a touchstone. This must have been really important reading to you as a child. So I'm interested to know, it's fascinating because it's not a perfect story, but whenever you talk to people of, well, I suppose from the day when it was written until now even, it's one that just constantly sticks in the imagination. So I'm interested to know why you think that is the case. And then a kind of secondary question is why you wanted to have that as a touchstone in your story.
So, why I think The Lion, the Witch and Wardrobe is still a book that endures today. Out of all the Chronicles of Narnia, it's the one that it's still taught in schools. Many children still read it. I don't know if they read the other 6, but they definitely read that one. Obviously, the Disney film came out not that long ago. It's being remade for Netflix, coming out in a year or so. So it's got huge appeal. And it's very short compared to most children's books today. It's well known as a Christian allegory, using Aslan as a kind of Christ-like figure who dies and is kind of resurrected. But I'm not sure it's popular today necessarily because it's Christian. I think it's popular because that story is just a really powerful story. The idea of sacrifice in a children's book, and the idea that Aslan, who is this wonderful, warm, powerful figure, dies, is killed by the witch, and the grief of Susan and Lucy when that happens, and then he comes back to life. It's, I think, to not be moved or stirred by that as a child, I think would be very unusual. I also think it works because C.S. Lewis said, famously, that the book came to him in a series of images: a witch on a sled, a fawn, a lamppost, and it's the way he knots these images together. I mean, no one else could make a story. It's a fantasy world that's really drawn from medieval fantasy, most of Narnia, but yet there's a lamppost in a wood, which is of course explained in The Magician's Nephew, but it's not explained in The Lion, the Witch and Wardrobe. Father Christmas is in there randomly, rather extraordinarily. It gives children incredible agency. They become heroes. These school children wield swords and they fight in real battles and they suffer real wounds, and which they overcome. And they end up becoming rulers. They end up becoming actual kings and queens. But also, I think the reason it's really popular is its simplicity in terms of fantasy. So lots of fantasy worlds, like C.S. Lewis's great friends, Tolkien, create worlds like Middle-earth, but Middle-earth doesn't feel, sadly, a world you or I can ever go to. It's brilliantly created and built, but it exists on its own terms wherever Middle-earth is. There's no access to us apart from through the books. C.S. Lewis had this view that, as did E. Nesbit, there's a sort of gossamer thread that separated our real world from other worlds, other dimensions, other possibilities. I don't really mean in a quantum physics way. I just mean other imaginative possibilities that existed, other ways of viewing our own world. And what C.S. Lewis does for children, and this really brings me to why I fell in love with it as a child, is takes the power of story and makes it concrete. The idea that as a child you don't need to be a superhero, you don't need to be extraordinary, you don't need to travel to a place like Middle-earth that doesn't exist. You simply climb into a wardrobe, and true on the other side is all this possibility and all this adventure. When my parents read The Lion, Witch and Wardrobe to me, and I must have been about 7 or 8, it really kind of blew my mind, because I think I didn't realise this at the time, but up until that point I think I probably had viewed stories quite literally. So a bit like early reader books, about Biff and Kipper and all this stuff, going to the park or the zoo, that stories were accounts of things that had happened. There's writing exercises you do at school. What did you do in the summer holidays, that dreaded one? But I suddenly realised that stories had this huge possibility, that reading the Narnia books, if you wanted there to be a magic world on the other side of a cupboard, there can be in a story. If you wanted your pets to stand up and talk, they could in a story. And if you wanted there to be a witch in the woods who could turn you into stone, in a story there might be. And once you grasp that possibility, that not just the excitement or the adventure of those fantasies, but actually that you can then explore ideas, things that interest you, things that trouble you, things that amuse you. Suddenly story is this incredible tool. And I don't know why children like The Lion, the Witch and Wardrobe today, but I suspect it's part of that similar reason, that it's very short, and in a few simple deft strokes and images and connections, suddenly children realise how a story works. I suspect when they read very skillful contemporary bits of fiction, where those mechanics are perhaps more disguised or less visible because we're kind of inured to it as a genre, a bit like, I think when Harry Potter, for example, is brilliant, but it's a very contemporary piece of work, so which borrows in its own way from all these traditions. But because Lion, Witch and Wardrobe is actually sets part of that ball rolling, you can actually go, oh, I see. That's what you do in a story.
I think two things as well that you've really touched on and talked about. One is the power of the visual. The other is the emotional depth and content, and it doesn't claw back from that. It's quite raw, isn't it, the way that it hits you? It
is raw, and there's life and death in The Lion, Witch and Wardrobe. You feel Aslan is really dead. You worry when you read the story the first time, how's they going to come back from this? That's awful, the witch as well. And it's also, the manner of his dying, his humiliation is like the Christ story. It is it's wretched, he's shaved, claws pulled out, the bullying, and I think as a child, that's obviously many children's worst fear, not the death, although I think death feels quite remote for children. I think it's the humiliation and the bullying.
And loss, maybe.
And loss.
The loss of a parent. It could be, they don't necessarily think of a Christ figure, but the loss of somebody significant.
Yeah, the loss of someone who seemed safe and secure and untouchable, I think is a huge thing. And there are themes of bravery and sacrifice, the children, betrayal, obviously Edmund. And so, but it's so short, it's 35,000 words long or something. There's no children's book, no fantasy middle grade book today that would have, of comparable sort of story that would be 35,000 words long. It would just feel bereft. And yet somehow C.S. Lewis manages to still, and it still reads today. I think it's because he was an unbelievably skillful writer and deft strokes. And also I think he was so confident in the literary traditions he was drawing on of, Renaissance literature, and the children's books he grew up with, like Ian Nesbitt and George MacDonald, that it was kind of in his blood. So it comes out in these very intense pictures, these very skillful characterizations that don't take pages and pages. There's no time wasted in Lion, Witch and Wardrobe. We barely meet these children, and they're off through a portal. We barely know where they've come from or their family. We don't know anything about their family home, really. Know very little about this mysterious professor, Mr. Professor Kirk. I also think it's a powerful book because it's written in a very key moment when about 80 years, well, just a bit over 80 years ago from when we're recording this, Second World War broke out. Sort of legend has it that over breakfast one morning, C.S. Lewis just declared, I'm going to write a children's book. I don't know as a direct response to war, but perhaps. And at that time, he was having a pretty tricky time in the sense that the woman he lived with in slightly unclear circumstances, Mrs. Moore, she had dementia and she was going senile. He was trying to care for her. His brother, Warren, was very sadly become an alcoholic and would go on these benders, and he had to manage that. And they had evacuees during wartime living with him in the house in Oxford, so he was managing that. The famous group, the Inklings, where he would meet Tolkien and these other writers, he'd had a bit of a falling out with because one of the younger female scholars who came had rejected quite publicly some of his latest writings on theology, and he felt it really thrown him. And so by the time, and then of course war ends, but everyone's lived through a war. So he's personally in very challenging circumstances. The country is, it's been just shattered. We've won, but the loss, the horror, the starvation, the fear. So I think the book, although it's a children's book, comes from a very intense place. So I think those deep emotional feelings that you're talking about do come from that, because they're really deeply felt. He didn't just write this in a sort of, a happy vacuum of peace and this would be a nice... I think it's an attempt to... It is a Christian allegory, but it's like all books, it's many things. I also think it's an attempt to sort of try and restore a sense of hope and calm to, a nation that was staring at a very uncertain future.
So you speak with great passion about this book there. Why did you, because yours isn't a retelling of this story, but we do recognise it instantly. Why did you, because your story could stand on its own without that, why did you want to make that link obvious to us?
So the story came about because it was about 3 years ago, 2016, I was thinking, what am I going to write about next? And obviously, people may remember it was that was a sort of quite pivotal year. And we had the Brexit vote. Donald Trump was elected president of the US, and even worse than that, we had Pokemon Go. But there was very much a sense of anxiety and upheaval. And so, like a lot of people, perhaps listening to this podcast, when there's lots of uncertainty and anxiety, I kind of retreat to reading. It's my safe place. And I just found this old childhood edition, Lion, Witch and Wardrobe, and I thought, oh gosh, I haven't read that for years. Why not? That's a nice comfort read. And reading it then, I think as an adult, I kind of clicked on all those things I've been talking about. The kind of the fact that wartime was there. I thought it was, and although I loved it, it still stands up as a story. I thought it was very odd that he didn't directly. It felt odd to my modern sensibility that he didn't really directly talk about the experience of war and these children, because it must have been huge. And I know why he didn't, because then it was too close to do that. But I thought how interesting it would be to do a version of this story where you did engage with those issues, and how interesting it would be to do a story now for children who perhaps are not getting into the nitty-gritty of whether we get a free trade deal or not, or Trump's foreign policy, but are absolutely, and I know this, and I'm sure teachers will know from how children speak in schools, because of the way the world's so connected now and technology. They're aware stuff is going on, and that there's upheaval and anxiety and tension, and no one in any children's book can offer an immediate balm to that. It's not the job of books, but I think what children's books can do is say, even in upheaval and uncertainty, there is always hope, and crises can be and ultimately are resolved. And that's what I thought, this is such a great model of a story, because that's really what he's doing away with Narnia. He's saying there is war, but through the wardrobe there is a better world that can be created. Better worlds don't come easily. You have to defeat the White Witch, sacrifice, and all that kind of thing. And I thought actually what's gripping us at the moment is we no longer know what's true. People say things that seem to be true scientifically or empirically, and people just don't believe them or choose not to believe them because it doesn't fit their worldview. People tell stories / lies, hard to tell the difference, and if the story fits people's worldview, it kind of becomes sort of truth. And so this idea began to form of a world which is about a battle between stories and facts, not to say one is inherently better than the other, but of course human knowledge comes through the melding of the two. It's no good having all the facts in the world if you can't communicate them through stories. And if you simply choose just to live in a fantasy storyland without acknowledging facts, you're going to end up in trouble. So I was trying to explore the middle ground between those two things. Again, not because from the children, I hope they just enjoy the adventure and the story, but perhaps later on when they think about it, when they're older, just as I for the Lion, Witch and Wardrobe, stuff comes through. And I think children absorb their reading deeply, and I'm always really interested by parents' uncertainty when they talk about children reviewing books and stuff, and often those reviews are a bit faltering, and they just say, oh, I like this bit and I didn't know about that bit. And that's simply because children don't yet have the critical grammar to talk about stories. It's not because they didn't enjoy it, it's just they really don't yet know how to articulate that, and why should they? But when you see a child reading and they're lost in it and the pages are just turning and they ignore calls to tidy their room or come down for tea or whatever, that they're really absorbed and it's really going in. And my memory of reading, it could be very, really intense in those worlds, and intensity that's quite hard to recapture as an adult. So I think if you're, your kind of job as a writer is to sort of make sure the story immerses them, and then to kind of just all the stuff you want to say about the world is packed in there, and whatever they choose to take from it or not is, that's up to them. And it's, I think you hope the book's appreciated on different levels by different people depending on what their needs are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've also made the point that actually you come back and revisit these things, and you might not know at that point in time what it means to you, but 10 years on, suddenly that seed or that idea drips through and you think, oh, that's what that was about.
Yes.
It means something different, something more. Without telling us about the end of The Lost Magician, how are you going to lead us into thinking about the frozen sea?
So, won't give too much away about the end of The Lost Magician, but it won't be a huge surprise that it probably does involve some children returning to the real world in 1945. So, in the Narnia books, obviously what happens is they were written really over a sort of decade of the 50s. And the Narnian timescale and the human timescale is sort of a bit odd because you can be in Narnia for years and years and not much time has passed in. So they're really all set in the kind of early 50s. But I didn't really want to do that because I think we look at stories on a slightly more ambitious scale now. So I wanted the next one to be at a critical time for me, which is 1984, which is when I read the Narnia books. It's also got a big time for this country because it's really when Thatcher presidency kind of bedded in and turned a corner, and the country changed a direction. And it was the time I got our family got our first personal computer, a very huge bulky thing. It was also the year that the Apple computer, the first Apple computer, was introduced in California. And of course it's the famous title of a book by George Orwell, all of which leads perhaps to a world which is exploring some of those themes of surveillance and technology, which indeed it is. And it's a story about a girl called Jewel who is related to one of the children in the first book. And Jewel is not having a happy time at school. She's being bullied. She lives in Newcastle. And one afternoon, fleeing from these bullies, she discovers a strange, mysterious second-hand bookshop she's not noticed before. And she dashes in there and manages to escape these people chasing her. And she's got her little pet hamster Fizz, who's extremely rude. I apologise for that in advance. And she starts exploring this second-hand bookshop. And one book, most of the books are very boring, and one book catches her eye, which is this huge leather atlas of a place called Folio that she's never heard of. And she sits down and she starts to flick through the big, heavy pages of this atlas. And what is strange is as she starts to read it, it's a map of sea, she could swear she almost feels the breeze of sea or a gust of wind, but it must be her imagination. But anyway, she starts to read and then she turns the page and she comes to the next map. Here was a map of a huge city with thick arteries of streets running up and down and so many buildings packed in between. It didn't look like any city she knew. There were huge pyramids, twisting helixes rather than skyscrapers, even some flying cars. The city of the unreads, Jewel read. She fancied that the noise of her own city outside suddenly sounded much louder and shivered, despite feeling a strange blast of hot air in her face from somewhere, which she tried to ignore. Now, why does that name sound familiar? The next spread was covered by miniature line drawings of trees, plants and streams, jumbled and crowded on top of one another, right to the edge of the paper. Even the scroll announcing the name of the sprawling forest was entangled with creepers, but not so much that Jewel couldn't read the name. The Idea Jungle. Fizz, I'm beginning to suspect that this map must be of a fictional or imaginary land, said Jewel. Fizz gave a snort which effectively translated as, you think? As if by answer, a green shoot bearing 2 small leaves inexplicably rose from the spine of the book, like a miniature beanstalk. Oh, no, you don't, cried Jewel. No more impossibility. That's it. She tried to slam the book shut, but she couldn't. She tried again. The book wasn't that heavy, yet something was holding the covers down, like they were chained to the floor. Then the green shoot was joined by another, and another, and another, until it looked more like a planted furrow than the paper valley of an open book. Creepers crept out from beneath the cover at an alarming rate, spreading their suckers over the pages. Jewel sprang back in fear. Except she couldn't, because something was grabbing at her hands. One of the creepers had flicked itself round her wrists, joined by more creepers binding them tight. More and more vines, spilling out of the book, spread over the shop floor, coiling themselves around her legs, her waist, pulling her towards the book. Fizz, run! Jewel managed to cry, and then the plant plunged into her mouth, silencing her.
Gosh. And of course here, rather than the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, it's the silver chair that becomes... That's one of my favourites, actually. It's got a feel of Arthurian legend to it. And of course the witch really appears again, doesn't she, in a different... She is Jadis, the witch.
Well, she's a version of
the sort of
the
green
Lady of the Green Kirtle.
So that story also was a powerful one for you.
Yes,
clearly.
I remember, because having made the decision to embrace the Narnia universe, I mean, I could have, and it's important to stress, these are all homages. They're not in any ways retellings or different versions. They're very different stories, but equally, if you know those books, you can see the kind of references in them. And I thought, well, it'd be more... I could try. Folio is a world of imagination. I can do anything. But I thought, I've started with Narnia. I think I should continue this. And one of the other books that really stuck with me is The Silver Chair, because it really stays in the memory. It's very haunting. It's about a girl who's being bullied at school, and there's a quest to recover a kind of lost prince who's gone missing. And as you say, it's very Arthurian, because there's Lady of the Green Kirtle, there's echoes of Gawain and the Green Knight, there's echoes of all sorts of those myths. There's giants. But most spectacularly, there's this underground kingdom which doesn't even know the world above exists, with this silver chair at the heart of it, where turns out the prince is trapped. There's a swamp creature called Puddleglum, who's one of most people who know Narnia is one of their all-time favourite Narnia creations.
Did you like him?
Yeah, I did like him,
because that ruined it for me.
Right, he ruined it.
Yes, for me, I wanted to take it more seriously.
Yes, yeah.
That's just a personal.
Yeah, because
thing.
he's. But I think what's interesting about Puddleglum is because the book is quite high fantasy. I think Puddleglum, for younger readers, especially in the 50s, it sort of connects. He grounds it. He smokes. Yeah. He gets drunk, and it's one of those odd things when C.S. Lewis does kind of more working class characters. It's a bit odd. They're kind of a bit like the cabbie and the magician's nephew. They're always kind of like a bit salt of the earth, if you know what I mean. So I split Puddleglum between a robot and a hamster in my book, and the story's quite different. I was really intrigued in this underground world because C.S. Lewis was interested in the sort of Plato's allegory of the cave. What is reality? Is this reality, or are we living in the copy? Is Narnia real? And is our world where we read books about Narnia the fantasy? And
if it exists in your head, is it not real?
Is it not
anyway?
Real? Exactly. Who's to say what is real? And then obviously in the Silver Chair, the characters say, no, there is our sun is there is no sun. The sun is this kind of lamp in the underground kingdom, and they're really thrown when they get up to when Jill, who's the heroine, leads them out to the real world. But as I remember as a child, that idea of dark subterranean gloom, and it felt very alien and haunting. And again, it was a bit scary, but I liked that. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed that sensation of being a bit freaked out. So I wanted to explore that, because the other thing I'm interested in at the moment is the extraordinary proliferation of technology into our lives. We're recording this on a phone. People might listen to this on a phone. We look at our phone all the time. They're wonderful, wonderful, amazing devices, but it's happened so quickly, and I suppose my view is we haven't really developed the stories to help us manage our relationship with them. Stories evolve from fairy tales and nursery rhymes and myths to help us manage our relationship to things that might be problematic, whether that's human desires or addictive substances. And there's no doubt that mobile phones are addictive as well as really good. And it's changing the way we think, it's changing our concentration, it's changing the way we interact with people, it's changing the way we store our memories, all these things. So it is big, and I just wanted to explore that. And so for me, my cave in the frozen sea is really that strange space where the internet is. Where is it? All these things, all our interactions, all our memories, all our news, all our jokes, all our facts, all our data about the world. Where is it? It's somewhere. So we place so much trust in these things, as because humans do. We're kind of credulous and we like shiny things, like magpies.
So tell us a little bit more about your Pandora then, whose technology with a bit of imperfection in there, because there's a danger in it being too perfect and too controlled, isn't there? Absolutely.
And so Pandora is a robot, really the Puddleglum sort of character who helps Jewel achieve her quest. And she's a bit of Alexa and Siri and Janet from The Good Place and lots of these things, but really all of which are versions of the technology we encounter in our everyday life, which is very imperfect, yet we seek to trust it. And so because Jewel from 1984 in Newcastle, the only robot she's ever met is a speak and spell machine, so she's absolutely mesmerised by this beautiful copper robot and follows her slightly at her peril. But yet at the same time, I hope that Pandora ends up, I don't want to spoil the story, but I'm not arguing in the book at all that that's necessarily bad. There's a lot to be trusted in this technology, but it's about, I think, we are human beings, and we have to keep our eyes open if we're to preserve our humanity. If we become part machine, part human, I don't know, in terms of our decision making process. And I think I suppose the famous example is the long haul lorry driver who can see that where Google Maps is sending him is literally down a lane the lorry won't fit to a cliff, and yet because the computer says that's the way to go, he goes there. Now, I know people tell these stories, isn't it funny, but actually it's really quite profound. It's like you can see with your eyes that that's not a good idea, and yet the computer says it is, and so you proceed. And when you think about the role algorithms have in our life in terms of medicine, many prison sentences in America now are handed out determined by algorithm. Some people say that's fairer than judges because there's no bias. But is that, we just, so I'm not, and again, this is a children's book, I'm not going to those questions there.
No.
But it's about creating a space, I hope perhaps in the classroom, where there can be broad conversations about this technology in a very kind of gentle, fun, interesting, exploratory way, not some sort of grand debate like, right, we have to now remove all mobile phones from the classroom. I'm not interested in that. It's about we should find space to talk about this stuff and tell stories about it.
Absolutely. And I guess the other side of that, just thinking about Pandora for a moment and where she might end up in the future, is the ethics that is now talked about in terms of protecting technology as though it were human.
Yes, and when is the line crossed? Because Jewel develops this relationship with Pandora, they become, in a word, friends. And the other thing I wanted to explore was, is it possible to be friends with technology? And, children already have maybe Alexa reading them a bedtime story. And I know very sadly some children who are kind of neglected, because you can have neglect through privilege as well through deprivation, is, children who are basically might talk to their Alexa more than their actual parent. What is that relationship? Is that valid? Should we be more worried about it? Should we encourage it? How do we navigate it?
I mean, we talked a lot about the big ideas there, but it is a good story, and it's an adventure, and it's a quest, and Jewel goes in to find somebody, doesn't she? Are we able to tell people about the quest element of this?
So what's happened is Jewel is the adopted daughter of Patricia, who is the eldest daughter of the original Lost Magician children. Patricia now is an unmarried geography professor at Newcastle University, whose whole life has been haunted by the fact that about 12 years ago, her sister Evie, who's a critical character in The Lost Magician, completely disappeared off the face of the earth. And when Jewel gets kidnapped by that book and taken to Folio, she discovers that Evie has been there. That's where Evie's gone. She's gone back. Because I was always interested in the idea of going back to Narnia, not as a child, as in the Narnia stories, but going back as an adult, trying to recapture something from my childhood, which of course is in a way what I'm doing a bit by writing these stories. And Evie goes back, and of course it doesn't quite work out like she planned, and she's gone missing. And so Jewel is on a quest to find her aunt, who's in real trouble, because she sees her kidnapped by the most terrifying dragon and sinister rider. So she knows she's in real danger. And it is a quest, and I really feel so passionately that whatever you're writing about for children, and this, I know people are different and people have different tastes, but I just think children have so many demands on their time that a lot of children face lots of barriers to reading. When you're writing for children, in today's world, the story has to be compelling. It doesn't matter what you're writing about. But I absolutely have always seen my job is the first job is to keep them turning the pages. Everything else that we've all been talking about is completely incidental. Is a bonus. It's incidental. If they turn the pages and read and lose themselves in a world that I want to give them pleasure. That is, I want them to enjoy it and escape their lives for a few moments. But I also hope that because I tend not to really compromise on vocabulary and things like that, that they'll also, all that will be going on, vocabulary and ideas percolating through in that secondary way children read.
So when you're thinking about story, is plot the most important thing to you, even more than character, or do you think they're equally important?
It does vary. These books, because I was trying to sort of model, so I use the Narnia books. I'm doing a different story, but I'll take like the key landmarks from the story, so like a portal, an underground cave, a quest, some giant creatures, those kind of, and I'll use them as kind of landmarks. And when I'm plotting the story, and I go, I want to hit those because I want to have scenes and bits in the story that echo, so it feels familiar. But obviously, lots of different things happen that have anything to do with it. In between the kind of connective tissue, so they are quite plot driven because I want to get somewhere, so I need to make that work. But then it has to be true to the character. So the plot for this changed a lot as the character of Jewel evolved, and I really got to realise who she was and what she was about. So I kind of start with plot, and then actually when you start writing, character always drives it in the end, because the plot just doesn't work. It feels weird if the character's not buying it. It does. Yeah.
You talked about connective tissue. And I guess one aspect of the connective tissue is these documents that are fed through that are official secrets that are then, what do you call that? Like Disclosure Act, isn't it?
So classified documents. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about where that idea came from.
It just kind of came with the story in the sense that I didn't want this just to be a kind of Narnia retread. I didn't want it just to feel like I was kind of repurposing period high fantasy for today's readers. So I didn't want it to feel old-fashioned, really. And again, I said children today, they consume narrative and story in so many different ways and on different levels. And so I just had this idea of the second dimension of these quite grown adult, really, classified documents that are newspaper accounts, scientific reports, cabinet papers, that all refer to some slightly nefarious thing going on. To do with the kind of real world attempt to kind of steal what's magical about the fantasy world here and deploy it in the real world. There's not some huge background overarching story. It's more like these little self-contained, a bit like, I want these books in a way you can read them together, but they are also want them to work as standalones. So equally, the kind of document story is a standalone story, but it's linked to the previous books if you want to explore. And it just, for me, it just adds a bit of darkness and a bit of edge, a bit of adult kind of sophistication, a bit of another genre like spy kind of genre, which I think is it just softens the kind of endless, yeah. The kind of quite the kind of rich. But the quite kind of richly coloured fantasy world. It's quite nice to have a bit of kind of black and white in between.
And also, there's something about it visually as well, and how it breaks text up, and we live in this multimodal world where we experience things visually. But actually, the C.S. Lewis books have Pauline Bain's illustrations, which must have been really important to you too.
Yeah, critical. And when he got the Carnegie in the end for the last battle, he said to her, "This is yours too." And in the beginning, he wasn't that impressed with their illustrations. He was a bit dismissive. They only met once at Waterloo Station. And she wrote in her diary, met C.S. Lewis, we had rock scones, he was nice. That was kind of it. So it wasn't a super close relationship, but I think by the end he realised what a critical part her illustrations have, and I think totally still do today. I think Narnia is as much Pauline Bain's as it is C.S. Lewis, because she created the image of Mr. Tumnus by the Lamp.
I was going to say, no, it's funny, that's the first one that you reach for, because that's the one I've got in my head.
Yeah. But so many
and
others
then the children
well.
Maybe, but it is that image of Mr. Tumnus.
Yeah, and Aslan frolicking with Lucy and all those things. So I
fascinating. Now, are we going to have more folio stories?
We are. I'm not sure when, because there's something else that I'm also talking about, and we'll be making announcements about both soon. But what I can say is whether it's the next thing or not, there definitely will be.
Fantastic.
And I know what the title is and I know what the story is, but I can't.
Okay, I'm just pleased to know that there's going to be more. That keeps us happy.
Yeah.
I would like to, because I know that you do a lot of work, both with the Unicorn but also the Ministry of Stories, and because our listeners are mainly teachers and student teachers, I'd just like to ask you some questions about that, really. Ministry of Stories, what amazing work. Are you involved practically or just as a kind of director,
I'm
guide?
really a sort of trustee. I did a wonderful, on the National Writing Day in the summer, I did a wonderful thing where it was wonderful for me anyway, where I gave a bit of The Last Wild to lots of the children taking part as a primer, and they went and wrote their follow-on stories, and we had a sharing, which is just the most fantastic, creative, brilliant stories were shared. It's just a great organisation, and at its heart is this deep belief that is borne out by evidence that if you enable children's creativity, that can make such a meaningful impact on their lives and their opportunities that lie ahead of them. Because I think if children are heard and listened to, then they start to develop confidence in their own ideas and their beliefs, and therefore their own futures. So at Ministry of Stories, we do lots of creative writing. We do everything from, we write music, we write poetry, but also some of our children do speech writing, and they go give speeches at the House of Commons to MPs. And everything we do has an outcome. So if a child writes a poem, we publish it in a poetry anthology. If a child writes a little movie, we shoot a little movie. If a child writes a recipe recorded from their grandmother, we publish some recipe books, and so on. So children start to see that this is not just a fun exercise, that creativity can actually lead to outcomes which are positive and definite. It's not about, if one of them becomes a writer or a cook or an MP, marvellous, brilliant. It's not really about that. It's about particularly focusing on working with children from very deprived backgrounds who might face very challenging circumstances at home, might have all sorts of issues also at school. There might be behavioural, there might be educational, there might be social, there might be mental health issues, and so on. What we do, and our remit, we can't go, is to work with them and harness the power of their imagination. What stimulates their imagination? What direction does it go in? And how can we then help them realise that and give them confidence that their imaginative view of the world, whatever it is, whatever form it takes, is not only a valid one, but one that other people want to hear and celebrate and make a noise about.
I do know from personal experience that when writing goes somewhere and therefore you get a response back, that's the most powerful thing, whatever that might be.
Yeah.
I once ran a writing project in Manchester, and the children had written poems, and we got them put onto buses so that so their families see the poems, and they're there. It
makes a huge difference. I think it really makes a huge. And that was the Nick Hornby who started it. Of course, that was the ethos from the start. That the writing wasn't just create an exercise, but the quantum difference between that and seeing, you've actually done something. You've put something that's been in a printed book. It's incredible.
Yeah. Can we also just mention that you write for the theatre as well? And I was talking to you earlier about how we came to see your adaptation of Box of Delights at Wilton's Music Hall. I understand that you're working on another project for them, which we will have the pleasure of being able to come and see this Christmas. Can you tell us what that's about?
Well, it's been a real treat because I've had the privilege of being asked to adapt A Christmas Carol. Now, some people may go, Christmas Carol, not again. It's true that in the year it first came out, it was 1843, 1844, I think there were 9 separate adaptations of it that year, and it's continued at more or less the same pace ever since. It's probably the most adapted story in terms of film, Muppets, play, musical, but I'm fairly confident, certainly on the stage in London, no one's ever adapted it the way we've done it, and that is that our Scrooge is in fact a woman. And I don't just mean that we've cast a woman to play a male part, but I've totally rewritten the story to look at what it would be like if actually that moneylender character was a woman. What's made her, what drives her, and her redemption is very different. So it is the Christmas Carol story. People are going to get, don't worry, you're going to get the Christmas Carol story that I love, that everyone loves. But it's also very different. It's very funny. I hope it's going to be quite moving. We're going to have wonderful puppets and magic, and the joys, because it's in Wilton's Music Hall, this incredible Victorian theatre. I mean, you literally walk in through the door and you are back in the 1840s. So it's a real privilege to be doing it there, and yeah, I'm really excited about it, as you can probably tell.
Yes, I'm excited too. I'm looking forward to that. Piers, when book 3 comes out in your folio, your world of folio, I'm looking forward to that too. And if the other project comes about first, I can't wait to hear what that is as well. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you, it's been lovely.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you've enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues. Just Imagine also has a free fortnightly newsletter packed full of the latest news, CPD training, reviews and giveaways. To sign up, visit justimagine.co.uk/newsletter.